Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be focusing most of my comments this morning on cannabidiol, but we'll also briefly review the history of cannabis or marijuana in medicine. So cannabis has been cultivated by humans for give or take 10,000 years. And it was initially used, we think, for things like rope and garments, bowstrings, and paper. And it's not entirely clear from the prehistoric record when it entered medicine, but certainly by 2700 BCE, it was used to treat at least 100 disorders from Chinese records. And that's where the origins of the initial cannabis plants, Cannabis sativa, come from. It was subsequently used throughout ancient kingdoms, including India, which is where Cannabis indica comes from, the other major species, and has been used in epilepsy, we expect or suspect from ancient documents, for at least 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. The idea that cannabis might be effective for epilepsy is not a new idea. As I said, Sumerian texts have it about 3,500 years ago, and Sir Richard Gowers, who is one of the fathers of modern neurology, an English neurologist, has a monograph on epilepsy in 1881 in which he gives this case report of a 40-year-old man who had fits or tonic-clonic seizures during both wakefulness and sleep, approximately once every 2 weeks. These attacks responded to bromide, which was the only known anti-epileptic drug between 1860 and 1912 when phenobarb came out. And then after 2 years, as often happens, the bromides were ineffective. Gowers prescribed Cannabis indica because England had such a strong interest in India. This was the kind of cannabis plant that made it to the US and most of Europe. He gave it 0.16 grains 3 times daily, and for 6 months, this man who was having seizures once every 2 weeks became seizure-free. The patient discontinued coming to the clinic and his medicine. The seizures returned. He came back to Gowers, started on the medications, had a complete cessation of seizures, and then during Gowers' sabbatical, one of the other physicians who didn't believe in cannabis stopped it, put him back on bromides. Seizures returned, and when the hemp or cannabis was reintroduced, it worked only for a short period of time. So again, there are these stories historically, which is a very nice kind of little controlled single case study that suggests that cannabis probably can be effective for some people's seizures. And to go to the scientific evidence, there has been a huge number of animal studies dating back from Mechoulam's first isolation of THC and CBD or cannabidiol back in the 1960s. And this slide summarizes the effects of various different agents. So just to take a step back, we'll be talking a lot about CBD, but THC is the canonical cannabinoid that has been most studied in neuroscience. THC binds to 2 cannabinoid receptors, CB1, which is the brain one, and CB2, which is the peripheral, largely immune receptor. So this slide outlines, and I'll just walk over here, these are modulators of the endocannabinoid system, which is the CB receptor system. And as you can see, there's no effect, mixed effects, or anticonvulsant effects. If you take CB or CB1 receptor agonist, this is THC basically itself. So THC would fit into this category here. This has largely beneficial properties, occasionally negative properties. When you antagonize CBR1 receptors, which is the opposite of what THC does, you get strong proconvulsant effects. Delta-9 THC itself matches pretty closely to the CBR1 agonist, which it is. And then CBD and a derivative CBDV have either purely anticonvulsant effects in about 75–80% of animal models, and then in about 20–25% have no effect on seizure threshold, but in no animal model study to date has the CBD or CBDV been proconvulsant. So as I mentioned before, there are 2 major species. There's another minor species, Cannabis indica, which is from India, and was first described about 1700 BCE, and Cannabis sativa. Cannabis is a complicated plant chemically. There are over 540 unique compounds that have been isolated from cannabis. Those with a 21 carbon terpenophenolic skeleton are called the cannabinoids, and there are often hundreds of them in a single plant. So it's not anyone who consumes cannabis and thinks they know exactly what they're consuming. It's a complicated deal. It has been said, and this is written frequently, but I think the scientific basis is limited, that sativa, which has a relatively higher ratio of THC, which is the psychoactive agent, to CBD, which is non-psychoactive, and CBD has a completely different mechanism than THC. It does not bind to CBR1 or 2 receptors, and we think works on a number of different mechanisms, including the GPR55 receptor, TRP receptors, and other mechanisms, but they're really separate ways in which they work. It has been said that sativa has more THC and indica has more CBD, and because that THC is both more psychoactive and more stimulatory, whereas indica is more relaxing. Having said that, the species have been so interbred for the last 50 to 100 years in this country and European countries that people who spend a lot of time looking at the genetics of these would say it's almost impossible at this point to pull them apart. They've been mixed together so heavily. Many strains have been bred for high THC or CBD content, but they probably both contain mixtures of both. So based on the animal models, and then based on a series of YouTube videos from a woman, Paige Figge, who treated her daughter Charlotte in Colorado with a strain of cannabis that was bred to be high in CBD, she posted a YouTube video of her daughter who went from having hundreds of seizures a day to being close to seizure-free. That attracted an enormous amount of media attention. There were newspaper articles. Sanjay Gupta did an eventual 3-part CNN piece on medical cannabis, featuring the Figges in part 1. And based on that, there has been an enormous set of interests that have emerged. The largest one, and I'll get to that at the end, is that 24 legislatures, as of about a month ago, have passed bills and legalized medical marijuana in their states. So it's kind of this remarkable and, in my mind, completely crazy situation that you have state legislatures voting to approve a medicine, and you have a federal government that classifies that medicine as a Schedule I compound, which means it has no evidence at all of any potential therapeutic benefit, which is absolutely wrong, as I showed from animal models, which there are about 80 experiments on now. In addition, a drug called Sativex, which is 50% CBD and 50% THC, is approved after randomized double-blind studies in Europe and Canada in 22 countries. So there's quite good evidence that the drug has medicinal properties. In addition, a synthetic analog of THC is approved for treatment of decreased appetite in HIV and AIDS in this country. So the idea that there's no medicinal benefit is clearly incorrect. And then the other part of Schedule I is it must have a high addictive and very dangerous potential. Now, I think THC probably, there is good evidence for some people that it can be habit forming, probably not to the degree that alcohol can be and many other compounds like opiates and benzos. But having said that, the Schedule I is an absolutely ludicrous thing, and hopefully there'll be a measure by the DEA and Congress to lower the scheduling, at least on CBD, but realistically it should be for all of those. So based on those sets of evidence, a group of us got together, some investigators from academics, and GW Pharma, which was the producer of that compound, Sativex, which was approved in Europe and Canada for MS spasms, and decided to start with an open label trial of cannabidiol. The idea was, since THC would bring more barriers, although the material that this girl Charlotte Figge took was a 20-to-1 ratio grown in a cannabis plant, 20 parts CBD to 1 part THC. We did a 99% pure CBD, which essentially no THC in it. And we enrolled a total of 313 children and young adults with various forms of treatment-resistant epilepsy. There were at least 6 Dup15q patients in my cohort at NYU, and this was done between 2013 and 15. Most of these were children, as I said, but some were up to age 41. And Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, for which double-blind studies have now been completed, were the target populations, and so were the group we looked at first. And overall, the answer is it was effective. About 50% of the kids of overall had a reduction in their seizures, averaging that number. The Lennox-Gastaut population, the mean reduction of atonic or drop seizures was about 70%, and among all patients, 47% had a greater than 50% reduction. Remarkably, in the Dravet population, 13% were seizure-free, and overall 9% were seizure-free. Now, the 800-pound gorilla that was sitting on top of us was the placebo response. I have never in my life seen a response of parents and patients, especially parents, to want to enroll in a study. When we announced this open label study, we had, I think, started out like 20 slots and got another 20 slots. We probably had 50 to 100 potential candidates for every slot. Down the hall from me at NYU is Jackie French, who runs the Epilepsy Study Consortium, which is the largest group of academic epileptologists in the world, especially in the United States, who get together to do a large number of trials for large pharmaceutical companies, startups. And Jackie typically has an incredibly difficult time recruiting subjects, which is common for all epilepsy trials. So he or she had drugs that had gone through major pharmaceutical companies, had a lot of early safety data, had efficacy data in animal models, and it was a study that was part of a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and she could barely recruit, and we could literally recruit 75 people for every slot we had. It was a crazy time. So one of the issues that people should be aware of with cannabidiol is that, like several other drugs used to treat epilepsy, steripental and felbamate, it inhibits the C219 cytochrome in our livers. And what that means is that drugs that are metabolized by that cytochrome, their levels will rise. Clobazam, or as it's sold in the United States, Onfi, is one of those drugs. And clobazam itself is not affected so directly, but its metabolite, which is an N-desmethylclobazam metabolite, which is biologically active and which leads to both beneficial effects, probably stopping seizures, and side effects like sedation, will increase up to 2-fold or greater for individuals who are put on CBD. And this is an enormous issue. I actually had discussions with GW early on, and they really thought this was not going to be an issue. Myself and others thought it could be, and the reason we thought it could be because we've lived through what happened with steripental. Steripental is a drug which is approved in the European Union to treat Dravet syndrome. The only trials done with steripental were trials in which it was added to both valproate and clobazam in children with Dravet. And the reason it's not approved in the United States is that the FDA, I think quite reasonably, says, listen, when you have a kid on valproic acid and clobazam and you add steripental, you double the levels of the N-desmethyl metabolite of clobazam, and we know that works in treating epilepsy. So how do we know that steripental isn't just a cheap 2C19 inhibitor? How do we know it has an independent effect? The French and other people, investigators, believe they were able to show it does using statistics and other mechanisms, but I must say, scientifically, I would probably come down on the side of the FDA. There's a good chance steripental does have efficacy in Dravet, but it's not clear at this point it's independent. And that is a little bit of an issue that will hound some of the double-blind studies with Dravet syndrome as well. It turned out some of the patients on clobazam, we did see levels increase, and the response rate of people on clobazam was 56% versus 35%. And this is also true in the double-blind study. There was a greater response in the clobazam group, probably because the N-desmethyl metabolite went up. And it's a real issue. Thankfully, we had a number of patients who were not on clobazam, both in the open label studies and in the double-blind studies. So we're in a much better position than the steripental studies were. But unfortunately, a large number of people were on that. So what was the safety issue? Again, there's this concept that I'll get to, the naturalistic fallacy. If something comes from a plant, then it must be safe. And anyone who has consumed a poisonous mushroom, eaten a puffer fish with a little tetrodotoxin on its tip, swam with alligators or sharks, knows that not everything that's natural is good for you. And indeed, cannabidiol does have side effects, and we saw it. Adverse effects that occurred in more than 10% of our open label study included somnolence, diarrhea, decreased appetite, vomiting. Convulsions, I must say, they were reported. I'm skeptical. This is a group of children with very treatment-resistant epilepsy. For example, I'll get to later, but in the double-blind study, status epilepticus, which was thought to be a side effect of CBD in this trial. In the double-blind trial, it occurred in 3 out of 60 patients in the placebo arm and 3 out of 61 patients in the active treatment arm. So again, this is why double-blind studies are so important. All of us, doctors, patients, parents, we're all incredibly biased. We all come in with these belief systems, and we're usually wrong about what we think. So 14 patients total, 4% had a side effect leading to discontinuation. These were often GI side effects. Some of these kids got bad diarrhea. Some of this may have been early on. We had a relatively dilute form of the drug, so it was 25 milligrams per ml as opposed to 100. And so some of these young kids were consuming a lot of oil for their body size, and it gave diarrhea. 12% withdrew because of lack of effectiveness. And 16 patients, 5%, had serious adverse effects that were considered treatment related. As I said, status was 4 of those. I think that was probably wrong. Altered liver enzymes, this occurred in both the open label and the double-blind study. Every single patient in both of those was on valproic acid, a medicine that's known to alter liver function tests. So in some ways, it seems like CBD can kind of potentiate that. And the same with thrombocytopenia. It's always been associated with valproate. And I'm just going to skip ahead to, this is some of the summaries from our Lancet neurology paper in January of this year, which really reported on the results of the study. And just to highlight, Dup15q was represented. I think there may have been a few Angelmans, but the numbers was really quite small, 1 or 2 in the overall study. And their response rate for these rare syndromes, including Dup15q, was very similar to the overall response rate for the bigger group. And this is a summary slide just to go over what the seizure frequency looked like from baseline to the different time points at 4 weeks, at 8 weeks, and at 12 weeks. So there was a significant median reduction in the seizure frequency for these children in the open label trial. But again, there's a big caveat here. There have been studies done, for example, at Colorado Children's Hospital, where many individuals, before 24 states legalized medical marijuana, Colorado was one of the pioneer states. Page Figge, the Stanley brothers, and Realm of Caring was kind of the epicenter of the medical marijuana for epilepsy activity. And so many families, some of my patients from New Jersey and New York, sold their homes, quit their jobs, moved to Colorado so they can get medical marijuana for their children, which was understandable. So one interesting thing that was done was doctors at Colorado Children's Hospital, when they saw a child who was on medical marijuana, they inquired and just took a historical background. What was the change in seizure frequency when you put your child on the medical marijuana? And for people who lived in Colorado and put their children on medical marijuana, the response rate, that is those who had a 50% or greater reduction in seizures, was about 1/3 as great as those who moved to the state. So if you moved to the state to get your child on medical marijuana, you had a 3 times greater chance of getting a beneficial response. And there was no difference in the frequency of the different syndromes between the out-of-state and in-state people. It was pretty clear that the more you give up, the more you're invested in a treatment, the better it works. And that is also known as the placebo response. So that is a big factor here that we were always dealing with. So I just want to talk briefly about some of the challenges that we face in studying medical cannabis, and one of the large ones is what I mentioned, the naturalistic fallacy. It is remarkable, and I think we're all sympathetic. We'd all rather take a tea to go to sleep that's made from leaves from some plant than take an Ambien. There's something intuitively much more comfortable and safer about the idea of having a tea to go to sleep than a drug, and I think it probably is indeed safer if it could be as effective. So another area that I discovered going into this literature, because I'd not really been involved in drug trials in children too often before, is that placebo response rates in children are much, much higher than those in adults, which seems counterintuitive at the least. So if you have a parent who puts their child in a randomized double-blind study, whether it's for asthma, anxiety, or epilepsy, versus a parent having the disorder themselves, the placebo response rate is roughly 50% to 100% greater. And one meta-analysis of every study that was looked at up to 2008 in epilepsy found that the placebo response rate in children in double-blind studies was 20%, and in adults was 10%. So again, part of that has to do with how invested parents are in seeing their kids get better. I would have gotten that one wrong on the multiple choice question without having read the literature. It also comes up very relevant in the study populations that we're involved with. So in a previous study of clobazam, which is now approved in the United States, Onfi, to treat Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, in that trial, had they have chosen the 50% responder rate, which is probably used in 80% of anti-epileptic drug trials as the primary efficacy outcome for FDA double-blind studies, they would have failed. They would have failed because of the placebo response rate. So the median 50% responder rate for drop seizures with placebo was 32%, and it was only slightly higher with clobazam.
I'm struggling with this a little bit. The folks that sold, they're more invested. They sold their homes across the country. But is that the only difference? Is it possible that there's some sort of selection there? They're more invested because they were in a more desperate situation. Nothing else worked for them. Whereas the folks in state, they could have had other choices, but it was easy enough to take.
Right, so Guy asked a good question. I don't think they had enough data to look at every nuance of the differences. I was very curious. I said, were there more Dravet kids or Lennox-Gastaut? And they said, no, the syndromes are really similar. There are just a lot of treatment-resistant individuals with epilepsy, but you're right. If you predicted it all, you would predict maybe people who moved had even worse epilepsy. The bar was greater. If you already live in the state and your kid's got mediocre bad epilepsy, maybe you'll try it. But if you're out of state, maybe your kid's got to have really severe treatment-resistant epilepsy to sell the house and move. So in that case, you'd expect they'd have a lower response rate, if anything, but they actually had a 3-fold greater. So I think the placebo response, and this has been studied in other things. If you have pain and we give you a placebo and we say it costs 5 cents, the response rate is 20%. If we give you a placebo and say it costs $25 a pill, the response rate goes to 40%. So there's tons of studies on the placebo response, and this fits perfectly. If you have pain in your knee and I rub something on the knee, there'll be a certain response rate. If I tell you I'm doing arthroscopy and do a sham arthroscopy, the response rate goes up 5-fold. So the more you do, the more you're invested. If you're going to have surgery, you're going to probably more likely have a better response. But I don't think that's been fully answered. Anyway, with this study, they actually chose median seizure frequency reduction, which is what we used as well, and that did show a statistically significant difference, which is why clobazam got approved. So again, just shows how critical, I must say, I was, until the data were released very recently, I was very scared in the double-blind study that a high placebo response rate would just kill us. We could have an effective drug that would never get the light of day because parents believed. So with THC especially, we also have to consider, and again, there are now 24 states where parents are giving, essentially they get doctors to write prescriptions, but many times parents are just dosing this on their own. Some are using THC rescue by blowing it, inhaling it and blowing it in their kid's nose. I mean, what's going on is the Wild West. There are side effects. So a New England Journal review from a couple years ago looked at this with THC, and again, it came from NIDA, and they have their own perspective on the world, but short-term THC and cannabis use in teenagers and young adults has been shown to impair cognition. Motor control has led to the, probably first break for schizophrenia and psychotic disorders among some individuals, and long-term probably can alter brain development, although in fairness, probably every other seizure drug can do that too. And can be associated with addiction, cognitive impairment, and psychiatric disorders. And then there's this issue of the perceived therapeutic benefit. So related to what I just said about Colorado, the Epilepsy, the journal did a poll. This is, I think, about 18 months ago now it was published. And they said, do you think there's enough evidence at this point that, it's clear that cannabis, medical marijuana, is both safe and effective to treat epilepsy? And essentially, the summary was among lay individuals, it was about 80% said yes. And among the professional epileptology audience, it was probably 25% said yes. So again, just this huge dissociation. And one good example of this, which is there's a lot online for those of us who live in this world, called the entourage effect. So the entourage effect is a fascinating effect. It was described by Rafi Meshalem, the Israeli scientist, who isolated THC. And what it described was the fact that when these compounds were given, there were effects on endogenous cannabinoid mimicking compounds in neurons that enhanced the effect. So it was the actual cannabinoid in the plant that was given, plus some natural compounds which worked together to lead to a synergistic effect, and showed this nicely in animal models, and described it back, I think, in the 70s as the entourage effect. So now there are many, many, many individuals in kind of the dispensary medical marijuana cannabis world, and I have patients who are so passionate that, and listen, on an individual level, I have no argument. If a parent says, when I added THC to the CBD, my child's seizures stopped, I can't argue with that. I mean, it's an observation of one. It may be the basis of moving science forward by doing a trial and doing a study. It's an interesting observation. That observation, I can tell you, that when THC was added, or THCA or CBDV was added to their kid, and parents are mixing these as alchemists, that they try to find the right mix to get their kid seizure-free or to the best control possible. On an individual basis, listen, if it was my child and I got one mixture and the seizure stopped, I would say, keep it up, don't change it. As a scientist, we have to do a study, and no one's done the study. Sadly, no one's done the study in a mouse, which is a pretty easy study. Take a mouse that has an animal model of epilepsy, give it CBD. I showed you those slides of 80 different models that have been done. Give it THC and see if there's an additive effect or a synergistic effect. You get more of a benefit than the two of them separately would do. It's been studied for hundreds of other compounds in epilepsy and other disorders. It happens not to have been studied yet for CBD and THC in epilepsy in animals. It's also not been studied scientifically in humans. It would be interesting and nice if there was an entourage effect. But there's a belief among individuals that nature has combined these things in its naturalistic way so we can get the benefit of it for kids with epilepsy. And that's harebrained. Plants make compounds for their own good. Capsaicin, which is what Guy enjoyed at his Ethiopian restaurant to give him heartburn last night in hot peppers, is a compound made by plants that fights off a fungus. It was not developed by natural selection to make our food taste better. That was a byproduct of what capsaicin does. CBD and THC were not invented by plants millions of years ago to treat epilepsy. It's great that they both do it in animal models, but the idea that nature knew the right combination to treat epilepsy is just anti-Darwinistic in my mind. So, but there's a lot of firm believers. They may turn out to be right, but I don't think for the reason they think. So to end, I just want to review the results of our first double-blind study. This was a phase 3 trial of Epidiolex, 99% CBD, for Dravet syndrome. It involved a number of US and European sites. 120 patients were enrolled between ages 2 and 18 years of age. 61 were randomized to CBD at a set dose of 20 milligrams per kilogram, which was titrated over 2 weeks. And 59 patients were randomized to placebo. They all maintained their concomitant medications, which averaged 3 anti-epileptic drugs. And many of them, as you can imagine, were quite treatment resistant, with a median baseline seizure frequency of 13 convulsive seizures per month. Those are what we counted. We felt we couldn't count staring episodes or tiny jerks, myoclonic seizures. Overall, the results, which have been released, have not been published, but released kind of in a press release, is that it was well tolerated, although there were adverse effects. And those that occurred in more than 10% of patients matched very closely with our open label study. And they included somnolence, diarrhea, decreased appetite, fatigue, fever, vomiting, lethargy, upper respiratory tract infection, and convulsion. 84% of the time, these side effects were mild. Serious ones occurred in 10 of the Epidiolex-treated patients and 3 placebo-treated patients. And discontinuation due to adverse effects occurred 8 times in the treatment arm and 1 time in the placebo arm. So again, it's a drug. It has side effects. The reason it works is it gets into the brain and it changes things, but that can also lead to side effects. Most importantly, during the 14-week period, which is what the FDA required, which is a little bit unfair because 2 of those weeks are a titration period where the kids are not up to the full dose, and the effect is by no means equilibrated in brain cells. But looking at that full 14-week treatment period, the median reduction in seizure frequency in the Epidiolex group was 39%. In the placebo group, it was 13%, thankfully a relatively low number. And statistically, the difference was significant. So this is the first study after 3,500 years of cannabis being used to treat epilepsy that we have human data that one compound from cannabis, CBD, is effective in treating convulsive seizures in children with Dravet syndrome. A similar study has just been released with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and essentially the same findings occurred. I will tell you, for the group, I think it was like 60% that was on clobazam, they did have slightly better results, but again, we had seizure-free patients who were not on clobazam. We definitely saw a significant reduction in seizures in the group not on clobazam. So I do believe we have evidence that CBD works independently of raising the clobazam metabolite, but probably, if you asked, I would say the clobazam metabolite probably contributes in part to some of this beneficial effect. So in closing, I just want to talk about where we go forward, as a nation. Probably, so there are 2 studies done, one in Dravet, which is positive, one in Lennox-Gastaut. There are 2 more studies that are either just about done or ongoing. They're dose-ranging studies. They have 3 arms, a placebo, a 10 milligram per kilogram, and a 20 milligram per kilogram dose, because we really have no idea what the right dose is. At this point, a lot of the children being given CBD from medical marijuana practitioners and the Stanley brothers use much lower doses in the range of 1 to 4 milligrams per kilogram. So those dose-ranging studies will hopefully come out by the end of this year, and with 2 positive studies, we would anticipate the FDA would approve these. But there remain 24 states in the United States that have approved cannabis products, some like New Jersey, where I practice 1 day a week, only allow parents to get plant material. They have to then take the plant material, buy a machine called the Magic Butter Maker, and make their own oil, which clearly can give rise to significant variability from batch to batch production by these parents in their kitchen. Others, like New York State, actually have oils or capsules that can be given out at specific doses and non-inhalable. A lot of people in New Jersey who do get it in the adult population use vaporizers or other ways to inhale the marijuana. So it is, like I said, in my mind, just the Wild West with incredibly strong opinions by many people, many of whom have financial interests, and many of whom just believe this is the way to go. But I think there's an onus on the medical scientific community to get scientific data. It would be bizarre for the South Carolina state legislature to say, a movie star came up and said Laetrile cured his cancer, which is what Steve McQueen did with his lung cancer. And then say, okay, it cured Steve McQueen's lung cancer, let's take it to a vote, we're going to approve Laetrile in South Carolina. Well, Steve McQueen did do that, and he unfortunately died about 6 months later. There were many, many people who said Laetrile worked, and they finally did a randomized double-blind study through the NCI, and it didn't work. And because it came from apricot pits, I think there's a little arsenic, and it did cause adverse effects, but it had absolutely no beneficial effects on cancer. We owe it to our patients and the children to do randomized double-blind studies. And so we need hopefully the NIH will help step up, and the DEA will, instead of going from a policing organization, be one that helps support scientific studies. But we need to look at the effectiveness of THC alone or THC and CBD combinations. I'm agnostic, but because so many children and adults are getting these products, we should have some idea of what their safety and what their efficacy is. Thank you. Larry?
For the Dravet study, I was a little surprised that you had 10 individuals that withdrew, and that seems to me high. I don't know if you think that's high, but it sort of speaks to side effects due to genetic background. That is maybe a whole angle that's not being really. Obviously, it's early, but it seems like that's a little higher than you would expect. Withdrawal, right? Because
Right.
that's a severe side effect.
And a lot of them went out in the first few weeks. So a lot of those probably got ramped. 20 milligrams per kilogram is a good dose. As I said, a lot of the kids in Colorado end up after 3 months on 3 milligrams per kilogram. We got these kids up to 20 mgs per kilo. They were on an average of 3 other drugs. So you can imagine if you were a child, you're right, who's a slow metabolizer with cytochromes and end up getting a big load of medicine as your fourth one, it may just tip you over in somnolence or GI side effects, and the parents may just say, this my kid looks terrible, I'm getting him out of here. And I think that's what happened. I think a slower titration period would have probably gotten over a lot of that, and potentially 10 milligrams may work just as well as 20.
I know you mentioned this at the beginning, but could you repeat the mechanism of action of CBD? I can understand like THC1 agonists and what they're doing, but I still don't have a good handle of what the mechanism.
So it's a great question. There's a lot of good scientists working on this question. I would say our leading best bet in 2016 is that potentially the primary effect of CBD is on GPR55 receptors. It's an orphan G-coupled protein receptor that CBD has great affinity for and antagonizes, and is thought to be involved kind of in calcium homeostasis. It also works on TRP receptors in multiple ways, and has some effects on serotonin activity and some alpha adrenergic activity. But so it's got a diffuse set of mechanisms. The GPR55 may be the lead mechanism for epilepsy. We'll see. There are a lot of good people working on that now. Yeah, I do know, and I can pull it out. It's in the range of like 3 or 4%. It's a small number. It's not a huge. It's again, take that, I can get you the exact number later. But it's a low number. But I think at least one, I think there was one, so there were 60 people in the treatment arm. One of those was not on clobazam, who got CBD, who was seizure-free. So that kind of gives a range. I think there were probably 3 others. It might have been, it might be up as to 6%. I forget off the top of my head.
Is the responder rate different between young people and older people?
No, I don't think we have enough power to really look at that. There were 61 people in the treatment arm, and the age range was 2 to 18. So I don't think we did an analysis looking at 2 to 9 versus 10 to 18. It's a good question. But again, I don't think we were also powered to look for that difference. Okay, thank you.